So we are wading into two subjects, actually three subjects. We're wading into the complexities of conservation plans, management plans, and also thinking about leases and how one can use structuring lease agreements with farmers to encourage conservation. So we've got a lot of things to cover in this hour and a half, but we're hoping it's going to be useful. And I say the complexities of so starting with conservation and management plans. This is, and particularly in this region of the country, talking about conservation plans as a way to engage producers and landowners around soil health gets complex because every state between Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Ohio have different both regulatory schemes and different requirements around conservation plans. So it's not particularly easy to say, it's not sort of one uniform approach to conservation planning, but we felt that it was still very much worth conversation about. In part, again, when we think back on the touch points, that conservation plans or management plans really are a fundamental way to engage either producers or landowners around soil health. And so thinking about how that works and what that looks like and what are the ways of using those plans to have those conversations around soil health is useful. So thinking about conservation plans, again, many land trusts, many public PACE programs require conservation plans. All of the entities that you represent, because you have FRPP easements, you obviously have a conservation plan requirement on those FRPP easements that is around highly erodible land. Some of you, by virtue of state requirements, might have a conservation plan requirement for an entire farm, right? And so these conservation plans may be written by NRCS, they may be written by a conservation district staffer, that might be some of you, they might be written by some other technical service provider. And in some of your states, there are also other plans, such as nutrient management plans, that might be required and are yet another entree for having you talk about soil health with farmers. The value of thinking about conservation plans is that, again, they are a way to talk to landowners and farmers about soil health. Some of you might already be doing that. You might be having stewardship visits where you are thinking about, you're showing up on a farm, you're having a conversation about where a landowner or a producer is with their conservation plan, but some of you may not. And I think this is a sort of thinking about conservation plans of what are the ways, how do we have conversations with folks about conservation plans if those are not conversations that you're already having. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is to have Dan Ludwig with NRCS talk through what are the opportunities, how is soil health now incorporated into NRCS's thinking and writing of conservation plans, and what are the opportunities if a conservation plan needs to be updated, that you can say that you've got an opportunity to update your conservation plan and think about practices that are going to help to improve your soils. So we want to talk about the NRCS process around conservation plans. Some land trusts don't use conservation plans if they're in a state where that is not a requirement of a state program. Those management plans are often used by a land trust to be, they're referenced in an easement deed. They might spell out what are particular resource and conservation objectives on particular parts of the farm and spell out what are practices that are either required or might be prohibited in certain parts of the farm. And again, it's a way that land trusts, and I think increasingly, are thinking about how do you use managed plans to encourage practices that are focused on soil health. So we want to talk a little bit about those management plans as well. And then, as I said, then we are at the end going to talk about conservation leasing. So let me introduce everybody here as part of this panel. Dan Ludwig is the state resource conservationist for the NRCS in Pennsylvania. Again, he's going to walk us through how NRCS addresses soil health in its conservation plans and planning. He's also going to talk a little bit about what a soil health management plan is. And is that something that folks can get from NRCS, and what does that look like? We have here Mary Chambers, who is with us now, and hopefully joining us will be Steph Tavares Bueller. I don't know if I pronounced her last name correct. Both of them are with the Sonoma County, that's California, Ag and Open Space District. So they're it's a little early for them, so we appreciate Mary joining us. Mary is the agricultural specialist with the county, and Steph is its senior acquisition specialist. And we're going to talk with them about management plans. Same thing with Nate Latoile. Nate is American Farmland Trust's New England director and has been doing some work with a land trust in New England around management plans. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And then last but not least is Sarah Everhart. Sarah is the Senior Research Associate and Managing Director of the Ag Law Education Initiative in the Carey School of Law at the University of Maryland. Got through that. Sarah is the author of an agricultural conservation leasing guide and is going to talk about structuring leases to support conservation. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to run this a little. We're going to start with Dan. Dan's going to talk, would then welcome questions about NRCS and its thinking around soil health and incorporating soil health specifically, or more specifically, in conservation plans. Then we will turn to a panel of Nate and Mary and Steph, and then Sarah has a presentation. So it's a lot to cover in an hour, but again, I hope that people who have questions and thoughts, obviously, again, in this room, there is a diversity of understanding and engagement already with farmers and with landowners around conservation plans. And some of you may be very experienced in this already, but I assume that there are some who are not, and I hope that this will be helpful. So with that, Dan, let's have you start and talk to us about conservation plans and soil health.
Oh, thanks, Chris. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time because timing is always awesome. So I've got 2 dogs home with me, and the propane guy decided to show up to do a delivery. So you're probably going to hear some barking dogs here. So I do apologize in advance for that, but hopefully that won't be too much of a deterrent here. So. But welcome, everybody. It's a great privilege to be able to speak with you this morning and talk a little bit about NRCS, our soil health management plans, and conservation planning in general that encompasses soil health. So one of the big questions is what is a soil health management plan? For those of you that might be familiar with NRCS, we've had plans in the past where we've called them CAPs, or conservation activity plans. And essentially what they are is a way to work with the producer, develop that plan and alternatives, and then come up with some decisions that that producer can make to implement practices to increase soil health on their farm. So the biggest thing we want to start with is, what is the landowner's objective? So, and that can be a broad spectrum of different things, but in a soil health idea, are they looking to increase organic matter of the soil? Are they looking to get more available nitrogen from cover crops so they can reduce the amount of added nitrogen from commercial fertilizer? So we really kind of work with those producers to figure out, essentially what do they want to increase, what do they want to do to benefit or increase soil health properties on their farm. And then we identify, that plan is going to identify what our resource concerns. So we categorize a few things specifically to soil health. So obviously soil erosion is a big one, and obviously that's why most of the plans are based on highly erodible land. So because we want to keep sheet and rill erosion, ephemeral gully erosion to a minimum, or to that level of T, which is the tolerable soil loss. But then we also back in 2019, Nrcs nationally added some specific soil health resource concerns. So we do look at soil organic matter depletion. So looking at, if there's tillage in the operation, how much tillage is doing is incorporating and breaking down that soil organic matter. We now also look at aggregate instability. So, the background behind me right now is a nice friable soil. So, a good healthy soil is going to have that friable cottage cheese type appearance, as you can see behind me. So again, tillage, lack of structure, lack of root material is going to break that down. And then we're also looking at soil organism habitat loss. So again, tillage, lack of living roots, decaying roots is all going to affect, the microbiology and the organisms that are living in the soil. So we talk about earthworms and beetles. So those are the main resource concerns that we're looking at. And then based on those resource concerns, then we're working with the producer to develop alternatives to address those resource concerns. So, and essentially that's where picking the different practices come into play on the operation. So looking at if they're not currently using cover crop, usually that's one of the biggest things that gets added to a soil health management plan, is the addition of cover crops if they're not already being used. Also looking at tillage. If they're doing tillage, is there an opportunity to switch to no-till completely, switch to no-till at some part in the crop rotation? Or if no-till is not an option to switch to, then are there opportunities to modify and alter the tillage operations on the farm? So, a lot of new producers may not have no-till drills, and a lot of times they're going to auction and they're buying low-cost equipment, which is conventional tillage equipment. So, there are options out there. So when tillage is still in that rotation, there are things we can do to help those resource concerns. And then we evaluate. We're going to evaluate all those alternatives, taking into consideration what the producer can do, what they're ready, willing, and able to do. And then it ultimately comes down to having the producer, the farmer, make that decision on what they actually want to implement, because these plans are their plans. They're not NRCS's conservation plan. They're not the conservation district's plan. It's the farmer's plan. And then we develop those alternatives to help them make that decision. So I mentioned the CAP, or the Conservation Activity Plan, before. NRCS is now for fiscal year 2022. We've made a switch. We're moving away from the traditional CAP plans to now it's going to be a three I say three-phase, three category plan. And soil health for us is one of those where it actually encompasses those three categories. So what you're going to maybe Scott later this afternoon when we talk about programs and financial assistance, maybe Scott Heckman, our assistant state con for programs, may touch on this. But the three main categories we have are our CPA, which is a conservation planning activity, which essentially is the conservation plan. In NRCS, we use the 9 steps of planning. And so the conservation plan, or that CPA, is the first 7 steps and essentially covers what I just talked about through that process. And then the producer will also have an opportunity to implement DIA, which is a design and implementation activity. And that's basically developing the plan of, what cover crops to use, what mixes to use, identifying where changes are going to be in that rotation for the different practices. And then soil health also has what we call a CEMA, or conservation evaluation and monitoring activity. And that's where we're looking at doing some additional testing, some follow-up, some record keeping to evaluate how that plan has worked for meeting the objectives and solving the resource concerns. The unique thing about the CEMAs, especially with soil health, is the fact that we can actually use that CEMA in the beginning to establish a benchmark. So a lot of farmers may say, I've heard about soil health, but I really don't know what I can do to fix it. There are specific soil health tests out there that can be run so you can establish that baseline level of soil health on the farm. So talking about the soil health management plan, that's our CPA 116, and that's where we work through that process, and we're going to start picking practices. Like I mentioned before, it might be conservation crop rotation, no-till, residue management, or reduced tillage, cover crops. And then where, I'll call it the exciting part, is the actual DIA. And that's essentially where that's that specific design. So again, kind of just touched on that, but that's where we're actually the producer's going to get those recommendations, the instructions, the mixes that they may need to use in their cover crops. And then the CEMA, again, that's especially unique for soil health management plans because, as I mentioned, there's different tests out there. Some of you may have heard of them. We've got the Haney test that was developed by Dr. Haney from ARS. There's the Solvita test. Cornell has their soil health test. And again, that's unique because you can run those tests and you can find out information like respiration rate of the soils. You can find out what your carbon and nitrogen ratio is, and that will help you determine whether or not you need to add legumes or more grasses to your cropping rotation to build that soil organic matter. And again, that CEMA, and you can actually use that at the end of the plan to say if we've run some baseline tests in the beginning, we can do follow-up testing to figure out, well, how much of a change did we make by implementing this plan? So, that's really how, NRCS, here at NRCS, we're looking at addressing and developing soil health management plans. And closing and wrapping up, Chris wanted me to kind of talk about, well, what if a producer already has that conservation plan developed for the operation? How can they work with NRCS to incorporate soil health practices and get soil health management into that current conservation plan? So essentially, this is one-on-one work where our soil conservationists will go out and make a farm visit. And we do have some different evaluations that we run either in field or back at the office. And the biggest one is our Cropland infield soil health assessment. And I actually have that in the file section. I posted that. It's an 11-page document, but it's really something that we do in the field, but it's also something that a producer. We can give that to a producer if they're interested, and essentially it's taking a shovel and digging a small soil hole, looking for soil structure. Is the soil platy? Are they finding bugs? Is the residue breaking down on the surface? And what's neat is part of that is we usually do a comparison. We look at right in the field, and then we may go to a fence row or outside of that field so we can have a comparison to something that's been undisturbed in a natural state versus the crop field itself. So, and again, that's going to allow a producer to, and our planners, establish, what kind of compaction may be in the farm, on the farm, soil organic matter. We're looking at soil colors, obviously. Highly organic soils are dark, so we can compare just the color of the soil in general. We can look at biological life, and again that aggregation of the soil. So is it that nice friable soil like you see behind me, or is it just all mush plated together, stuck like in big dirt clods? So, and then also at the office, typically as part of your conservation plan, we run our soil erosion prediction, otherwise known as Russell 2. And we do get some values out of that allows us to determine where we might be able to make some improvements on soil health, because that's going to give us our STIR rating, or our soil tillage intensity rating. So if we're climbing to 80 or above, there's a good bit of tillage going in, and we know that's going to affect the soil aggregation. It's going to affect the soil life and the amount of organic matter. And then also, it'll also give us what we call our soil conditioning index, or our SCI, and that's a measure of the effects of the tillage and the cropping rotation on building organic matter. So, if we're at a negative SCI, we're losing. If it's slightly above 0, we may be maintaining. And if we're 0.5 and higher, it shows that that rotation could be building organic matter. So, and again, we're going to add, so wrap up real quick. So we're going to add those practices to the conservation plan. Again, it's the same practices that would be developed from the conservation activity or DIA plan. And then obviously from there, as you'll hear later this afternoon, there can be financial assistance opportunities from Nrcs to actually get these plans written, or actually get those practices implemented on the farm. So there's a lot that we can do, to incorporate soil health into conservation planning and plans for the farm.
Great, thank you. I want to make time for that was a lot. I have to say that a couple of those acronyms went a little over my head. For those of you who are deeply involved in conservation planning, hopefully you understood. But let me see if people have questions, and either feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat. Oh, wait a minute. Hang on. No, I'm not sure. So, anybody questions for Dan? Well, I do have one question, and folks, feel free to raise your hand, or again, put a question in the chat if you want. So to make sure that I understand, and let's talk about it for a minute. Say that it is so I guess actually this is a question. Thinking about an absentee landowner, right? So those conservation plans are typically with the tenant, not with the landowner?
Correct.
Yes. But if a landowner were to say, well, I had somebody who let me know that, really there are ways to improve organic matter, and I ought to be thinking about soil health, and how about we get a soil health assessment? Does that request need to come from the farmer tenant, or could it come from the landowner? How would that work? And would that step, again, be the first step, be to do a soil health assessment?
Absolutely, yeah. So, yeah, either party can make the request for a field visit and to have one of our assessments run. So, yeah, typically it may be, and we've run into this before, where the tenant farmer may be set in his ways, and it's how they're going to farm, and the landowner themselves are interested in improving their farm because obviously there's a lot of impacts to it, and maybe they're looking at changing tenants in that. So the land, even though they're an absentee landowner, they are the landowner, and they do have the opportunity to have input into that plan. And we've had good relationships where a lot of times if we can meet with, if the absentee landowner is going to be in the area, we schedule a visit with both. If we can get them, the tenant and the landowner together, that usually works the best, because then, the landowner can get our advice, see the results, especially if we run the infield test, and then, the tenant will have the opportunity to hear the same message. So, but yeah, either party can request that.
Okay, great, thank you. There's a question in the chat, which is, are DIA and SEMA brand new additions to NRCS conservation planning activities?
Yes. So essentially, they're taking that old CAP, or conservation activity plan. So, so something like a comprehensive nutrient management plan used to be a CAP 102. They're now breaking that into 3 different parts. So, so they're essentially, those 3 components can work together, where you will have that CPA, which is the conservation planning activity, which essentially is just the conservation plan. The DIA, or the design and implementation activity, is actually kind of the design and the instructions on how to implement the plan and implement the practices. And then, yes, they've added the SEMA, which is that evaluation part of it. And the unique thing is, not to take up a lot of time, is it's a new system, and not every CPA has a DIA and a SEMA, and not so it's a new system. We just kind of learned about it. We had a nice big training on it yesterday, but yes, in the soil health side of things, yes, the concept of the DIA and the SEMA are new.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
That is very helpful. Appreciate that.
Thank you for the opportunity.
We are going to switch to talk about management plans. Again, these are more a device that are used by land trust than public programs that typically seem to talk more about conservation plans. Management plans seem to be a little bit more flexible, but again, I think there are both land trusts that have established easements that reference management plans, and there are obviously land trusts that are thinking about how to use management plans, how to reference them in an easement, and talk about using them more proactively to address soil health objectives. And before I pose the first question to the panelist here, I also want to recognize Kara O'Connor, our AFT Midwest Farmland Protection Manager. Kara has been doing a lot of work collecting easement language examples and management plan examples from around the country, where there have been entities that have used management plans to achieve certain conservation objectives, and in places where they have used easement deed language as well. we are going to be, Kara and myself, along with folks from the Vermont Land Trust, Washington Farmland Trust, and Minnesota Land Trust, are doing a session at the LTA rally next month that is going to focus specifically on management plans. So if anybody really, we're not going to have the time to dig into them as much here as we will at that rally session. So if folks are going to rally, you might want to come join us for that session. So let me start with you, Mary. And I know that Steph was not going to be able to join us. I don't know if she has joined us yet, but Steph, as soon as you are on, you are welcome to jump in. The Sonoma County, and I can't remember if I said at the beginning, yes, I did, that Sonoma County, California. But you are an example of a public entity that uses management plans. So they're already, I keep talking about it, that it's just a land trust tool. Obviously it is not, because you are a public entity and you guys use management plans. But I want to take a step back before we even get to the management plan. So can you talk a little bit about Sonoma County's approach to addressing conservation objectives? So what does your easement require on the conservation objective fronts, and when do you use management plans?
Sure. So Sonoma County Ag Preservation and Open Space District approaches conservation values in our easements. We generally, our traditional approach to conservation values in the easements has been to aim to maintain the conservation values that are already there. So we typically have language in our easements that requires landowners, for example, to not damage the soil values and not damage, for example, the water quality values on that property. So that's kind of standard language that we include in all our easements that helps support preservation of those values. And then there are some circumstances where we do require or have a requirement for a management plan also written into the easement. So the kind of case where we would see that would be something where there is an expectation of a use on the land that may impair those conservation values if it's not, if it doesn't have a management plan supporting proper land use. So for example, if we had an easement over a natural land area and that easement was just preserving the area in its natural state, we wouldn't require a soil management plan because there wouldn't be any activities that we would expect to impair the soil value. But if we had, for example, an area with sensitive conservation values and we expected the land to be used for row crops, for example, that would be a case where you might require a management plan that would help to ensure that the activities on the land wouldn't impair those conservation values. And I also want to mention management plans, it's a really broad term. So it could be anything from just a few page document talking about what practices to avoid to something really comprehensive that would set out goals and that would typically be prepared by like a professional rangeland manager, for example.
Great, because that was going to be my next question, is when you do use those management plans, who is developing them? So I guess let me ask that. So is that something that you all have internal expertise to develop them, or do you look to, do you work with a conservation district or somebody else to develop those plans?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And for our case specifically, because of the constraints on the funding that we have and the staff capacity that we have, we generally need to have outside partners to develop those management plans. So we'll often direct landowners to seek out experts, and we might require in the easement, for example, that the management plan be developed by someone with a certain certification. We're not allowed to require, you have to ask Jim to develop your management plan, because that wouldn't be necessarily viable use of public funding, but we can require, for example, you must have a certified rangeland manager to develop your plan. We often encourage landowners to work with our resource conservation districts to develop plans. They're really great at that. They're very supportive of that. But they don't always work with the resource conservation districts. They may work with a professional of their choosing, as long as that professional is in line with the requirements set out in the easement.
I get you. And then when you, for those places that you do have management plans, and thinking that this also relates to places that have conservation or entities that use conservation plans, how often are your stewardship staff then having conversations with those producers about those management plans when they show up on a stewardship visit? Are they saying, hey, let's talk about what that management plan looks like, and does it need adjustment, or how are you feeling about practices that are recommended in there or prohibited in there?
So since the management plan usually isn't developed by the district,
Right.
we're not necessarily going to be checking up on like the exact details of the management plan. One case where we would be more involved with the management plan and its implementation, it would be when the management plan is developed in response to an easement violation. So if, for example, we noticed an easement violation in the sense that the soil quality is being significantly impacted, we observe erosion, for example, we might then encourage or request as a cure for that easement violation, as a way to make up for it, that the landowners develop a management plan, and then we would have to approve the management plan and check up on whether it's being implemented. However, typically the management plan is more, it's not necessarily the district's management plan, it's the landowner's management plan. And so it's typically more that they're implementing it. It could be, a source of discussion if we know that the landowner's goals involve maintaining the soil health. We will check up on that, but that's more because it's already in the easement. I think that we would like to have them be more of a jumping off point for conversation about how to steward the conservation values around soil health more actively, but that's kind of something we're just starting to think about now.
Great, thanks. And that is a question, and I'm going to go to Nate here next, but I would be interested in any of you participants who have used management plans and are thinking about sort of how you address soil health in management plans. So think about that. And I'll come back to folks in a minute, but I do want to pose a question to Nate. AFT has been working, I know, with a land trust that owns land in fee, and thinking about developing and is developing a management plan for that land in fee, and that is addressing soil health. And I think whether or not there are folks in this training who some might be with entities that own land in fee, but I think it's also just thinking about what a management plan might look like if you really were going to focus on soil health. And then on the backside is, if understanding what Mary says is that they're not writing the management plans, but they do want to use it as a way to engage landowners, what's the expertise that you need to develop as a land trust if you're going to write a management plan that's going to look at soil health, and then you actually want to engage the farmer on that property around soil health? So share your thoughts, would you?
Sure, certainly, Chris. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me to be here today. Costs are always a challenging thing to talk about when we have folks from all over the country and different costs in different areas. So I guess initially what I'd like to talk about is just kind of what drives the cost of these plans, and it's hours and soils tests. It may be some miles in a car if we have to drive to the farm and how many times we have to drive there. But it's primarily labor that's driving the cost of a management plan. Depending on the type of management plan and the particular goals of having one in place for the property, NRCS in every state has a practice scenarios guide. It's a PDF. It's probably available on the state NRCS website. And for all their different kinds of conservation activity plans, right in that practice scenario, they're going to lay out what their estimate is for how many hours it takes to do one of the plans and who it is that's going to be doing the plan, what their certification levels are going to be. NRCS has developed those because they're planning on cost sharing with some farmers, and they need to know what the average cost is going to be. So it's actually really handy that a really smart entity has done this for every state in the nation on the conservation plans that are likely to be done in that area. You may have to reach out to your state resource conservationist just to find where that is if you're not super familiar with your state's NRCS website, but they've got them. They're estimates, they're averages, but they're a really good starting point to understand. For a soil health management plan in Massachusetts, 30 to 50 hours for an agronomist to put together that plan. Whether a land trust wants to pay for that, whether the land trust wants the state Department of Agriculture to fund them, whether you want the farmer to get one from a conservation district, whether you want NRCS to pay for it, somebody still has to pay that cost. And figuring out if the farmer is bearing that cost, to figure out if you as the land trust is going to help the farmer do it, or whether we're going to ask NRCS to support these activities through their existing system. It's just important to know what it actually takes for every one of these plans, 30 to 50 hours for just a soil health management plan. The project that Chris mentioned specifically that AFT is doing on behalf of a land trust, they have 6 farms that they own that they're looking to determine what the right level of agricultural activity is on those properties. And the right level for them is what they feel is sustainable. So they're looking for some recommendations from an agricultural expert. Those 6 farms are made up of 31 different fields. They're all within about an hour and a half of where AFT staff that are equipped to do this kind of thing are based. And so we have the staff to do it. This project, we estimate, is going to take about 550 hours of our time over 6 months. There's going to be about $10,000 worth of soil testing costs. We're doing soil health assessments in every one of these fields. And while the soil health assessment isn't that expensive, we're doing 31 fields, and there's sometimes multiple tests per field. Usually it's multiple tests per field, so they just add up. When we have large farms and we have large protected properties, the cost of doing these plans add up pretty quick. We're going to evaluate the current soil health of the fields in relation to the benchmark and target conditions that are reasonable for the geography and soil type. We're going to identify yield constraints for sustainable agroecological production goals. We're going to determine the capacity of the fields as natural climate solutions to sequester and store carbon. That's above and beyond kind of a regular soil health management plan, but it's something that we're really excited to do to help the land trust understand what capacity the fields have to sequester and store carbon. We're going to develop a field ranking system to prioritize management activities, set production goals and trade-offs between soil health, ag production, and native biodiversity, things like grassland bird habitat, pollinators. This isn't our land. It's not up to us to say what should happen on the land, but it's up to us as an expert to help the land trust decide what are the trade-offs here. If we increase the intensity of the ag production, what are we losing from a soil sequestration standpoint, from a bird habitat standpoint? We're also going to help them determine the best practices to improve soil health, to improve production, and to actually improve the climate resilience of the various farms and the fields involved. Because it's one large project, we think we can do it pretty cost effectively. It's still $75,000 for these 31 fields. It's a significant cost. And there is a life expectancy to this product as well. Science changes, the land changes. As they implement some of these practices, we're going to have new basically new baselines, right? We're going to have a new place where we are to understand what the land is doing right now and how we can improve it. So we estimate that this work product will be good for 5 to 10 years. Somewhere in that 5 to 10 year time period, we're going to have to go back and update it, or they're going to have gained the capacity in-house to update it. One of the final questions that Chris had asked that I think is important to that is, what sort of skills do you need as a land trust to be able to steward these things, to be able to do them yourselves? You really need agronomic experts on staff. You need folks who understand soil chemistry, soil health, not just folks who understand it, but folks who can actually give good, detailed technical advice. You need a soil scientist. You need people who have been practicing agronomy for a fairly long period of time. Nrcs actually has an approval process for technical service providers. It can be a really good benchmark to kind of just understand what the qualifications for these kind of things should be. They do a pretty good job of vetting kind of who should be allowed to do these things, what sort of background they should have, what sort of experience they should have. Again, your state NRCS office can help you understand what the TSP qualifications are, may even have posted for a lot of these different activities what the list of approved TSPs are for the state that you're operating in. And that might just give you a list of people that you could contact for consultants, or if you're looking to actually hire staff, to understand what sort of qualifications you should be looking for in hiring staff. But you need somebody who can go out into a field and identify sheet or rill erosion. You need somebody who can go out and do a soil health assessment, understand how to identify soil compaction and what it means when you have it, where it's likely to see it in any field, where it might not be unreasonable. We still try to reduce it, but in a particular field, particular locations are going to have generally higher soil compaction than others. And what's reasonable to expect from a farmer if we're trying to improve the soil health of the land? We can't get to 100% on day one. Based on where we are now, what are reasonable improvements we should make? So, Chris, maybe that was helpful. Hopefully there's a little bit of information there for folks.
Yes, that is very helpful. And let me pose both, Nate, to you and to Mary. And I think Steph has joined us, so she is welcome to jump in as well. Here's a question from Noel, who says, in a management plan, if the farmer and land trust disagree on if practices are, for example, degrading the value of the soil, who arbitrates? It seems like there's a lot of room for disagreement about the extent of degradation or things like that. Who wants to jump in there?
I'll jump in.
Hi,
I've
Steph.
actually had this happen, not at the district, but at a previous employer. So my main job is writing easements and writing contracts and all of these things. So within that context, we have language in our easements, and so did my previous employer, that specifically addresses this exact circumstance. If there's a disagreement about a practice, about a property use, it either automatically triggers mediation or arbitration, depending on your choice of language and choice of venue. In the case specifically of the management plans, I have seen several different land trusts do this with success, where they have language in their management plan section that says they can, instead of going to mediation or arbitration, go to an objective third-party expert in the field. So typically that would be someone certified by NRCS or a certified range manager or something like that. And that person can essentially act as mediator prior to going to that formal step of mediation and arbitration. It's especially if you do that route plus the mediation route, I think it can help sustain those relationships with your landowners and maybe calm heads a little bit. That's been my experience, where you can take a step back and say, okay, we could be wrong, you could be wrong. Let's bring in somebody else, and we'll both agree on who that's going to be. And it does take some time to actually get to that step where you have someone in place, but at least in that period, unless it's something really dire that's causing really severe issues, it just allows you to calm heads a little bit, maintain that relationship, and then depend on that neutral third party.
Great, thanks. Nate.
Yeah, I think the nice thing is that the science is actually pretty well established on most of the practices that our farmers conduct about how they impact soil health. I think what's going to be really important in this case, though, too, is what does the easement say? Does the easement allow for generally accepted ag practices? Does the easement require best practices? Does the easement require somebody to take every possible step to improve soil health, or to really understanding what the goals of the easement are? Are we just trying to not do any harm? Are we trying to mandate improvement? There's a really good foundation in the science about what helps and what hurts. But we also have to understand, like, what does the easement say we can require as a land trust? What is our role here? Is it to give technical assistance and to support a farmer to do better? Or are we actually allowed to require them to implement certain practices? And that really comes down to the individual land trusts and their easements.
Right, thank you. I want to give folks a chance either to ask any questions of Mary, Steph, and Nate, or to offer your own thoughts on, for those of you who have either used management plans, have management plans, or are thinking about it. Anybody want to share their thoughts on how they're using it and how they're thinking about it in the context of soil health? I'm looking to see if I see any raised hands.
Oh, I give you one.
Yeah.
So I'm with the Cecil Land Trust, and so in our easements for the last few years, we have typically put in, we had a general healthy soils that we put in there. When we first go meet with the landowner, we'll take a map and they can, draw on a map like where the problem areas and things like that. When I go back, I'll do some research on the best land management practices for them for healthy soil, and then we'll have a second meeting. So then I can introduce what, for the crops or whatever we need, the buffers, things like that. And then we address that then. And then once we establish that, okay, we're all on the same page, then we'll get very specific to each landowner and what we'll have in the conservation easement. And it's worked quite well.
That's great. And then, so that's language that you have in the easement. So do you have management plans as well, or it's just that you figure out in the, I'm sorry.
We partner with the Cecil Soil Conservation District, and we will get the advice from them and their experts, and then we'll incorporate all of that into the easement. And a lot of times they'll even come out and when we're doing the for the closing.
Great. That's helpful to know. Other experiences?
Chris, there is a question in the chat. It says, a question for Sonoma County. Are the soil health management conservation plans made by the contractors more detailed than the NRCS soil health plans? Question mark. If so, what else is included in the plans?
I'll take that one. They tend to be different and plans for different purposes. Typically when we have a CRM or an associate range manager do a plan for a landowner, we're looking at a whole property management and trying to balance preservation of certain sensitive natural resources with an ongoing grazing operation, for example. And so we're trying to have requirements and guidelines that can change over time to address changes in the ag operation so that they don't impact the sensitive natural resources or allow the natural resources to be enhanced through agricultural practices that are consistent. Typically when we see something targeted more at soil health or at just the agriculture areas of the property, that's usually when people choose to go straight to our NRCS and do a conservation plan. And largely that's circumstantial. It's because we have funding in our county. We're very lucky to have funding where those plans can just be paid for through a grant that we have. And so they're free, they're readily available, there's staff resources through our resource conservation districts to get those started and done. So they really kind of have slightly different purposes, I would say. So you're going to see different things in them. That's not a good answer, I know.
No, that's good. That's helpful. Thank you. All right, last questions. If folks don't have any other specific questions or comments, let's turn now to Sarah. And Sarah, your presentation on leasing.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. Good morning, everybody. They put the lawyer before lunch. I'm going to try not to put people asleep. I am here to talk about leasing, hopefully be able to pull in some of the pieces that the other experts have gone over today. I work for the Agriculture Law Education Initiative. As Chris said, we're a University of Maryland program. We're made up of attorneys from 3 different parts of the University of Maryland, and we cover the state. We provide legal education to farmers. And so there's our website. It's umaglaw.org if you've never checked us out. Couldn't help but do a shameless plug for an event we've got coming up. We've got an agricultural and environmental law conference. It has gone online. And so it's going to be over the course of 2 days, November 17th and 18th, and it's only $35. Students are free. Going to be covering a lot of conservation related issues. And so you can register for that on our website. All right, getting down to it. Conservation practices on farmland. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I've done a lot of education on this in the last couple of years. And so I'm excited to dig into it. We really started focusing on this at the Ag Law Education Initiative because Maryland squares up with the national average. We've got about 40% of our farmland is leased. As most of you probably know, we're sort of in the final stretch of the Chesapeake Bay cleanup. So we thought this was a really vital issue. And we knew that conservation practices were less prevalent on leased acres. It was sort of a generally acknowledged fact. And we wanted to dig in on that and say, well, that's not going to cut it when we're scraping to try to meet these Bay cleanup goals. What can we do to support farmers? And why are we hearing from farmers that their conservation practices, they have those on the home farm, but not on the acres they lease? A lot of different reasons for this, and there's some great more sociological based papers and studies. I'm happy to try to help people connect with those resources, but in general, there's a couple different reasons. Communication is a big one, as I'm sure a lot of you who work in this space between landowners and farmers know. Often we've got communication breakdowns. Some of those are willful communication breakdowns. Sometimes the farmers are very happy to have limited communication with their landowners. It can be for a variety of different reasons. Maybe we've got non-operating landowners that live out of state or even out of the country. But if we don't have landowners and farmers communicating, it's going to make implementation of conservation very, very difficult. Leasing uncertainty. So what I mean by this is if we've got leases on a handshake, which we still have plenty of in Maryland, or if we've got short-term leases, there's not the certainty on the part of the farmer that needs to be there. There's not the stability that they need in order to invest their time, their money into these practices. And that's a big part of the reason why we see them on home farms and not on leased acres. And then finally, really important, a knowledge deficit. So I too was struggling with some of the acronym soup that's been thrown around in the session. I'm on my local soil conservation board. Every time I think I got my arms around it, there's some new acronyms to learn. It's a lot of technical information, and sometimes landowners really feel at a deficit in this area. And that, can create a lot of problems. It can lead to them simply deferring to some decisions because they just really don't think that they've got the base of knowledge to be a participant in the conversation or in the decisions. And that can be a stumbling block. All right, so what are we going to do about this? So the Agricultural Law Education Initiative, we partnered with the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology, and we got support from a SARE grant to create the Conservation Leasing Guide. I think you all have access to it. We created this document to be very user-friendly for folks who have a deep base of knowledge, all the way to somebody who just inherited a farm or just bought a farm. So we started real basic with who are the different players, who is NRCS versus a soil conservation district versus an environmental NGO, and what roles would they play in the process. What leasing and communication strategies are there out there? So, you know, what do you need to know in order to think about leasing in this space? And then how can you put some simple language in your lease? We don't advocate for complicated language, no Latin, nothing in your lease that needs to be something that you don't understand, but simple language that references some of the, you know, the partners, the landowner and the farmer's conservation priorities. Our thought is that if you put together a simple lease that reflects the agreement of the two parties and reflects their conservation goals, you're going to create that stability that you're going to need in order to have those practices actually be put in the ground and be successful. So these are the steps in the process. You know, obviously you got to communicate to assess goals and reach consensus. Considering the term, extremely important. And I think a lot of landowners need some education on how important the term is. Setting farming standards. So not many states actually have a clear implied covenant of good husbandry. And all that means is it's not very clear typically in the law what is good farming and what is not good farming. And so I think some folks, there can be some confusion about, you know, if we end up in a legal conflict, we'll go to court and it'll get straightened out because a judge will understand what is good farming and what is not good farming. I would not assume that. I think you need to talk about how how the parties think about this land, how they expect it to be farmed. And once they do, if there are certain practices, if we have certain tillage expectations, if we have utilization of cover crop expectations, those things should be addressed in the lease. The number one thing we hear from farmers about this project is, please don't rile the landowners up about this because it's just going to add to my costs, right? It's going to take land out of my production for me, which is going to hurt my bottom line. And I'm going to end up having to assume a lot of maintenance responsibilities that I didn't have before. So I think it's really important for landowners to understand that and to consider the time and the money that the farmer is going to have to take on with some of these practices. Agree to revise and review it, very important. I know not everybody is as passionate about legal documents as I am and leases. Sometimes people sign these things and they want to put them up on the shelf and they go, oh, I did it, I have a lease, don't need to worry about that. A lease is only valuable if it's actually reflective of what's going on the land and actually reflective of what you've agreed. So it's really a living thing that needs to be reviewed annually and revised. All right, so easy for me to say that communication is important. I know it can be really difficult for people. Simplest way to break it down is, the question the landowner needs to be asked is, what are your future plans for the farm? I unfortunately get calls all the time from upset farmers who were under the impression that the landowner's plans for the farm were something very different than what actually ended up playing out, especially when farms end up getting sold and the farmer did not understand that that was the plan, and maybe they had made a conservation-based investment in the land that they thought was going to pay off for them. So important to just have the conversation with the landowner. What are your future plans? And then there's no one better than the farmer to ask, what do you think about the farm could be improved, right? Do you think there's practices that we could put in place on the farm to improve soil health, to reduce erosion? Just asking the farmer, instead of being intimidated by the farmer's expertise, capitalize on the farmer's expertise and say, what are you seeing out here? What do you do on your own farm? What do you think we could do? If you look at Appendix B of the Conservation Leasing Guide, we break down some communication strategies in a lot more detail. Length of the lease, probably the number one important thing. Short leases discourage conservation practices, full stop. We have seen through our educational efforts, landowners not necessarily having this base of knowledge about how important the length of the lease is. So I think it's really important if you're in if you have an opportunity to sit down with a landowner or a farmer, or they're asking you, what could we do? What's the simplest thing? Simplest thing is give farmers more time on the land. They need a longer term investment. And we all know these practices take time to yield results, right? Very few of these practices are going to do anything overnight. So we're going to need a term of the lease that's going to match the life, when we're going to start to see impacts from the practice. Okay, setting standards, a lot of different ways to set standards in a lease. And, those of you who have been discussing today that you have easements that have conservation standards in them, I think that's great. And referencing the easement and the standard in the easement is a really easy way to do it. You can just simply, reference a standard from a State Department of Agriculture or a county soil conservation district. Another way is to reference a conservation plan. So, we tell people all the time, the conservation plan can be a great way to kickstart the conversation. If you've got a conservation plan that you haven't looked at in a while, or that needs to be reviewed, or if you want to go in and talk to your NRCS or soil conservation folks about creating a plan. I liked what I heard about, we'll come out to the farm, we'll do all these tests. I mean, these are public services, right? These are our tax dollars at work. I think a lot of people are receptive to the fact that conservation plans are free and customized to the farm. And there's probably a lot of landowners out there that don't even realize all these services are available to them. And it's a way to get the parties to start working together and educating them together on the conservation needs of the farm. In terms of addressing specific practices, I think it's important if there are specific practices that the parties expect, or if you have something like a structural practice that you need to put in, or if you've got required buffers in your conservation easement. So, don't underestimate the knowledge deficit. If you're dealing with landowners, you're probably going to need to define the practice. So just like I don't advocate for using legal words in leases that are not readily understood, I don't advocate using conservation terminology that's not easily understood either. So if it's not clear, you can define it in the lease. And then, as was said before, not every farmer is going to be able to switch on a dime to some of these practices. So there needs to be considerations about whether something like conservation tillage is appropriate for this farm. Does the farmer have the equipment? Would starting as reduced tillage and then phasing to no-till be beneficial? What are going to be the implications? What's the disease and weed management challenges if we're changing our tillage practices? So I think, like I said before, I can't say it enough. We really strive to keep leasing partners together. We want to keep farmers farming the land that they're currently farming. And I think a quick way for there to be conflicts and potentially a loss within that farming relationship, for the farmer to say, this isn't worth my time anymore, is for a landowner to sort of dictate farming practices without having a conversation. So I think it's worthwhile. So in the conservation leasing guide, we have some sample considerations for popular conservation practices to help the landowners have some thoughts about what the discussion points need to be. This is just a sample, all of these need to be tweaked for individual circumstances, but for conservation tillage, you could have language like this: the tenant in consultation with soil conservation or NRCS, shall reduce tillage as much as possible in accordance with the conservation plan. And then if you want to be more specific, tenants shall maintain at least a certain percentage, like 30% residue cover on the ground surface at planting. I had conversations about this provision with a farmer that I know that leases a lot of ground. He doesn't like to be told what to do, but he was comfortable with this provision. I think with all of these, you want to leave some amount of wiggle room for Mother Nature and for, just the things that are gonna occur. Got to be careful with these leases that we don't draft people into a corner. We want to set expectations in order to reduce legal conflict. And that's, sort of the point of talking about the specific practices. All right, so considering the costs, I mentioned that was really important. So we got a number of different costs that can come up, right? We have initial implementation costs, yield, profit losses, and then maintenance costs, which are all very real. And we want to consider at the outset, how are these costs going to be allocated? Who in the relationship is going to bear these costs? Are these costs going to be addressed in the lease? So if there's an expectation about who's going to be bearing the cost, that type of specificity, you know, it's a good idea to think about whether you want to put that in the lease so there's no confusion later about that. So, you know, in some cases, rent can be discounted. I know that's not always the most popular option. Sharing of program payments is possible. It needs to be done carefully, but, you know, that's something that definitely can be done. And then, you know, if things are tight and you don't think there's any monetary benefits that can be bestowed, thinking about, you know, whether a longer lease term would be something of value. Don't forget about the tax implications. So if you go to the conservation leasing page, we've got some more resources for all of this. We've got a webinar talking about how to split the conservation payments. And we've got a resource document about the tax implications. You know, it's great to encourage a landowner to get into this space and, you know, and sign up for some program payments, but nobody wants an unwelcome tax surprise. And if landowners are not familiar with, you know, getting program payments and don't expect them to be considered income, that can be something that creates conflict. So you just want to make sure that that's clear up front. Here's some sample language for some compensation options. So, you know, ways that you could discount rent over time, you know, or in a specific year. A lot of different ways to do this. These are just some samples. And again, there's some more strategies within the leasing guide itself. Okay, troubleshooting. So this isn't, you know, recommendations for everybody, but it's just considerations. It's going to depend how specific you get in your lease. You know, if you're talking about an area where you know, maybe you've got a phosphorus concern, you want things to be very closely monitored. If the landowner wants the right to get on the farm, to inspect and to take soil samples, they're going to need to put that in the lease. If they just want access to the soil samples the farmer's taking, probably be a more popular option, that too should be in the lease. Sharing a nutrient management plan. We have required nutrient management plans in Maryland. This is not a popular farmer option, I can tell you. The nutrient management plan is personal to them, not to the farm. It does create conflict when a landowner wants to see the nutrient management plan. The Department of Agriculture does not give those to landowners since they're personal to the farmer, not the farm. If you're going to have something in your lease about the lease being subject to the farmer complying with the nutrient management plan, if you want a copy of the nutrient management plan, that specificity, that's also going to have to be in the lease. And again, you know, I mentioned this previously, but agree to meet annually, or, you know, have an annual phone call where you specifically talk about the farm, verify the practices. We all know buffers move, right? So if you can walk around the farm and take a look at practices and what's going on, I think it would, you know, help the long-term leasing relationship. And revise the lease as needed. I think people get confused about the ability to revise a document. You don't necessarily, you know, have to draft up a whole new lease. You can cross out sections, you can, you know, write something new and each initial it, and you've revised your lease. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. That was a lot of great information in a very short period of time, so appreciate that. Who has questions for Sarah? Feel free to either raise your hand, put them in the chat, or just to jump right on in. So thinking about the scenario for many of these folks who are working with, right, landowners, their relationship is typically with the landowner because that's who they have negotiated the easement with. You know, it may be an absentee landowner. And we had a good session yesterday afternoon that talked a little bit about particularly women landowners who may be very conservation minded, but not feeling necessarily empowered to ask much of their tenants. And I'm still focused on what you said about there are a lot of handshake deals, right? And so it's very hard, I think, for someone who might have had a farmer tenant who they like a lot, but they don't feel that they are necessarily doing as much as they would like to see on the conservation front. And they don't have a written lease. And do you have suggestions for how an easement staff might sort of even engage in that conversation with a landowner on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I would take a look at the communication prompts that we have in Appendix B of the guide, because we have
Okay.
split up for the landowner and for the farmer. Questions to ask yourself if you're the landowner, and then questions to ask the other party. So I think, you know, it does have to start with some internal questions about the landowner's, you know, plans for the farm. Are they, you know, why are they holding on to this farm? Is it a family legacy situation? Are we planning on selling the farm? And I think a good place to start would be Extension and Nrcs. I mean, I think having a conversation with those folks and asking some questions that you might not necessarily want to ask the farmer would be a good idea, just in a way to empower yourself with some information before you initiate the conversation with the farmer. I mean, we had one of the folks that went through our education program in Maryland. It was a very similar situation. Woman landowner had a farmer she was very happy with, who had been a farmer for decades. She was anxious about initiating the conversation about the lease. She successfully did it, and they have a lease now, and she sleeps better at night. And I think the best way to think about it is, this is to protect both of us. I mean, a good lease is not one-sided, right? A good lease is going to protect both parties. And the farmer is really way more exposed in terms of business operations than the landowner is, right? In a lot of situations, depending on where you are, you know, there can be a lot of farmers clamoring to rent ground. So landowner kind of, you know, may have the choice to pick another farmer. The farmer's probably got money and time, and, you know, that's land that they may have been farming for a long time. So it's a mutually protective document, and all it's doing is putting that handshake down on paper. So there's not confusion later on. I think, you know, when we get folks that are very entrenched in the handshake, because, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, they usually end up going to written leases after they've been burned. And that's unfortunate, but true. You know, I mean, after, you know, landowner passes away and they end up having to deal with the next generation, and it does not go well. And there is, you know, confusion, which leads to conflicts because there's no lease. So I think framing it as mutually protective is probably the best way to go.
Great. Thanks. That is very helpful. Okay,
I'll note that there's a comment from David Satterfield saying, I just wanted to share a quick tip for easements. One of the things we have included in more modern easements is an authorization for the land trust to contact the Soil Conservation District directly to receive the Soil Conservation Water Quality Plan, since it's a requirement of the easement. David, is that specific to Maryland, that requirement?
I mean, that is just in our easements, and we work in Maryland. So the Maryland templates tend to require soil conservation, water quality plans, and forest stewardship plans when a purchase easement is done and those are involved. And so we used to have to send an authorization form in separately to the landowner and then into the soil conservation district. We had trouble getting those forms signed and sent back to us, and there was always some coordination issues. So we ended up just putting a restriction into the easement, or it's in the body of the easement, that gives us the authorization that we would normally get from the landowner when they sign those conservation easements. Just sort of streamlines that for us, and makes it a lot easier to make sure we have those on record.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay.
I have a question if people have time, or
Look,
if we
Well,
have time.
Yeah,
Kara,
Michelle
let
and-
me, we also have David and Michelle. So if it's,
Okay.
was it, so let's go to David and then Michelle and then come back to you if we have time.
Okay. Hi, I'm David Boos in York County, Pennsylvania. And Sarah was talking about the short-term versus long-term leases and how the long-term might be better for conservation. But I would caution there some because in different situations, because like landowners that have just bought like a new farm, we deal with a lot of that. They don't really know who should farm, whatever. And I would generally advise them to have a short-term lease initially and get to know this new farmer that they don't even know. And because we have to deal with, violations, and we wouldn't want to see a long-term situation where they don't know the guy or the farmer, I should say, and there's a problem and they're stuck in this 10-year lease and we have to deal with this every year. Compared to like a 3-year lease where they could, if it, like Sarah said, if they have the language written correctly, it would help them. But new owners, especially that don't know the landscape, I would probably advise a short-term lease just to get to know, is this farmer going to be cooperative? Is this farmer a good farmer? Just a comment.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. Michelle.
I was just going to follow up from the other David Satterfield for the Maryland forms of easements, and for our ag land program a couple of years ago, we changed our language to be able to contact the soil conservation districts directly, and also DNR for forest management plans as well, that we can get them if we don't get them from the landowner.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I think the MET easement now also has that language built into it. So seems
Yeah,
like
I think
in
we
Maryland,
all,
at least, we're all
yeah, we all tried to kind of add that in a few years ago because we were having challenges.
Great. Yeah, that's a useful addition. Kara, go ahead. You had a question or comment, and then if anybody else does, that will be last word. So go ahead.
I wanted to pose the question to both participants and the speakers about the possibility of using photographs, digital photographs, to document change over time. I'm curious whether anybody uses that in your stewardship visits, and whether that could be useful to kind of show a soil health problem or erosion over time, like, hey, it used to look like this and now it looks like this. And then whether anybody has any tips for using photographs in a stewardship.
I mean, I can say from ESLC's perspective, being an LTA accredited group, that we have to take a minimum of 6 photos per visit of the landscape, oftentimes more in the line of 20 to 30 photos each year that we do our annual monitoring. So we can monitor the changes to the habitat, to the soil. We can see the changes that are occurring on the property pretty regularly. And we're sort of required to do that both through our policies and for our accreditation.
Great. And Steph, I see you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I was going to say basically the same thing. It's pretty standard out here in California anyway. One thing that I have found useful back in my monitoring days, which ended a couple years ago, was taking a big red hula hoop out with me, because most of ours are grasslands, and so we're measuring for grass height and residual dry matter and that kind of thing, and we don't necessarily have time to clip and wait, and just throwing a hula hoop out in the field and seeing what did it look like last year, what did it look like this year in the same spot happened to be useful for us. It's a pretty funky old hula hoop at this point. It's pretty beat up, but at least it gives you a kind of a frame of reference in the photo for height and size and all of that.
Love it. Love the use of a hula hoop. All right. Go
I'll
ahead,
also
David.
point out, we implemented drones about a year ago for our monitoring. And so we've been able to see the landscape at a greater level using those through our photos. And, you know, that has led for us to be able to basically build our own tips on people who might need help with certain management practices. But that's still something we're kind of figuring out.
That is an excellent point, David. And I guess, you know, back to whoever it was who, I think it was Andrea who made the point earlier of the recon that you might want to do before you go out to a site or a stewardship visit. For those who are using drones or even satellite imagery to be able to look and be able to assess resource concerns before you even step onto the farm is very valuable.